to the House.
I call Andrew Little.
Mr Speaker, I take pleasure in rising to speak on the Local Electoral Amendment Bill number 2. And Mr Speaker, say that the mere fact that electoral practices must be free from corruption goes without saying. It is essential for our democracy, the sort of democracy that we are used to and that we celebrate here, is that electors must know that the people who are standing as candidates, who are seeking public office, are people of integrity and free from hidden constraints or promises or connections. And so that has been the tradition in New Zealand, both at the central level but also at the local government level. But the sad reality is, Mr Speaker, is that our reputation is under threat. Our reputation for a corruption-free electoral system and corruption-free electoral environment is under threat. There have been the odd alleged transgression at the central level. I remember a flyer that was produced when I was the National Secretary of the Union was referred to the police once. The police were so embarrassed about it they ran to apologise for wasting my time. And then there was the National Party that has always concerned itself with corruption issues, suing me and the union I belong to for being involved or having a connection with the Labour Party in the 2008 election. Took it twice to the High Court, and in the end the High Court judge got thoroughly annoyed and threw the whole thing out. But when it comes to local government elections, Mr Speaker, there is no question. We have reached the high water mark. We reached it in 2010 in the Auckland mayoral election with the candidate, none other than a member of this House, John Banks. And that must surely be a source of huge embarrassment to members of this House who have watched the tawdry affair unfold in this House, but to every Aucklander and to most New Zealanders, to watch what happened and to watch every effort made to conceal what went on, eventually a police investigation, and then a huge effort to get the police file disclosed to the public and a matter of considerable public interest. And eventually it was. And what we saw in that campaign and what we saw with the conduct of John Banks was an act of courting of donors, one in particular, a very large donor. When I say a large donor, the donations, of course, were large, but so was the donor. We saw extensive contact between the candidate, John Banks, and the donor, Kim.com. That contact involved meetings, involved parties, dinners, complimentary remarks to his wife, trips on his helicopter, observing fireworks displays. I could not imagine a more extensive range of memorable experiences, and yet, in the inquiry and in the ensuing public, disclosure. Listen, I travel on helicopters with my donors every day, of course, and maybe it's a novel experience to John Banks. But how affronting to the intelligence of the Auckland public, the Auckland voting public, that he should declare that he could not remember any of those activities. And then with the allegations of soliciting donations, that's what the police found in their inquiry. As the police said in their report, police have established, and I'm quoting now, police have established that in September 2010, Mr John Banks personally solicited a request for help from a donor who prefers to remain anonymous. And yet Mr Banks was able to get away with a declaration that did not disclose the identity of that donor because the legislation in place then and in place now did not require it. How could you have an anonymous donor that was known to the candidate? That's not anonymous. That is a nonsense. And I think the pity of it is when we look at people in public office, someone like Mr Banks, who has occupied high public office, not just an MP, not just a leader of a party, albeit a one-man party, but a former cabinet minister. And he knows the story about ethics, and he knows the expectation of the New Zealand public is that people and those in public office don't just comply with the letter of the law, but that they should comply with the spirit of the law. And he has totally failed in that standard. And it's even more disappointing that, of course, the Prime Minister of the day, who held out great hope to the public of New Zealand that he would have high standards in public office, at least in his cabinet, has not been able to follow through. The Prime Minister has defended Mr Banks's conduct on the grounds that he technically complied with the law, not that he complied with the spirit of the law. Well, that just isn't acceptable. And Mr Speaker, at this point, when we know all the information that has now come out, however grudgingly and however it has to be prized out with a crowbar in this dreadful inquiry, leads us to one conclusion, and that is that we all smell a giant rat. We all smell a giant rat, and it's not very pleasant. And it has led to this law change, notwithstanding Grant Robertson's own members' bill. The government has produced its own to achieve the same effect. And so this bill represents a new spirit, at least, a new spirit that we should be holding all candidates to in local body elections, regardless of where that local body election is. And I just want to draw attention to one problem, however, that I see in the legislation. And the Select Committee, no doubt, in its deliberations and its consideration and inquiries will look more closely at. It's in Clause 27. There's two particular sections. The first I'll talk about is Section 103H, which talks about, which is about anonymous donations, that they must not exceed $1,500. And it refers in that section throughout to an anonymous donation not exceeding $1,500. But try as I may when I read that section and the other sections that are around it as part of Clause 27, I cannot see that that section deals effectively with what I would call the .com cheque splitting problem. Is that it does not prevent a candidate from, or a candidate's team a campaign staff saying to a donor who wishes to remain anonymous, don't give us $3,000, give us 2 cheques for $1,500. The candidate won't know and we won't need to tell anybody. It doesn't stop that from happening. And so the Select Committee will need to look very closely at that. And then in Section 103F of Clause 27, it talks about those involved in the administration of the affairs of a candidate. If they know the identity of a donor, they are required to disclose it. But there's nothing in that clause, in any other section in that clause, that requires a candidate who knows the identity of a donor to disclose it. And that went to the heart of the issue with John Banks's Auckland mayoralty campaign. He knew who some of the big donors were. He knew Kim.com was a donor. He knew that Sky City was a donor. And they handed him an envelope with the cash in it or a cheque in it, made out to Team Banksy. And then he claimed that subsequently that he did not know who the donor was. Well, these provisions, Mr Speaker, don't go far enough in that regard to remedy the problem that the John Banks Auckland mayoralty campaign threw up, made us all throw up as a result. And so those issues will have to be addressed as the Select Committee deals properly with it. Mr Speaker, I come back to my opening comments, and that is that all electoral law, whether central or local government, needs to require of the candidates and those working with them and those administering those campaigns to work to the highest standards of integrity. The New Zealand public expect nothing less. And our law must reflect public expectations, and we must make sure that as this law goes through the House, that it properly reflects the expectations that New Zealanders now have of those who seek public office. And those standards, those expectations, Mr Speaker, I suggest, have probably risen a notch or two now because of the embarrassing affair that was the John Banks mayoralty campaign. So, Mr Speaker, as my colleagues have said, we will support the bill because it will achieve a great leap forward in terms of electoral law and electoral integrity, but there is some work that needs to be done, and we look forward to the Select Committee doing that work and bringing back a bill that will cover off all the issues raised by that tawdry, nasty little affair.
Mr Speaker.
Alfred Naro.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I stand and take a call on the Local Electorate Amendment Bill number 2. Mr Speaker.